Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode. This is an SVT, no prizes for guessing that really. But when did it come out? Well, let me tell you. This is the story of one of the most iconic bass amps ever made. Now, back in the mid to late 70s, when rock music was pretty huge, if you were a musician and you were playing in a local band, having tons of gear was a badge of honor. More was definitely better. If you had more Marshall stacks than the next guy, you were rocking harder. If you could fill a stage with your Hammond organ and Leslie speaker cabinet, then you were definitely going to sell more records than him. That was the mindset back then. And having more gear meant you were more serious about what you did. It wasn't unusual to see drummers with double bass drum pedals, guitarists with triple-necked guitars, and bass players with not just a bass guitar but 2 or even 3 at times. And like I said, you weren't necessarily looking for portability, because moving all that gear was a pain anyway. For example, my friend Keith Williams here, he was a guitarist back in the day, and he's also an amazing artist. He's done wonderful artwork for many famous musicians, including UFO and Ozzy Osbourne. But back in the day, he used to play with a band called Wild Turkey, and they shared the stage with some pretty big acts. And he remembers those days fondly, and he gave me permission to use a little bit of his story in this video. So thank you very much, Keith. Keith said, back in the early 70s when Wild Turkey was together, we played a lot of gigs. Support bands back then would have to supply their own back, so we were expected to turn up with our own gear. We didn't have a manager or a roadie, so it was us for doing everything. It was hard work hauling gear like that every week. There was no such thing as a backline company back then, so if you wanted to play a gig, you'd have to supply all of the gear yourself. Our rhythm guitarist turned up with a Les Paul and a Marshall stack. Lead guitarist brought a Gibson Explorer and a second Marshall stack. The drummer had a Premier kit with Zildjian cymbals and a massive 16x22 bass drum. I think the bass player had a Rickenbacker 4001 bass and a huge Ampeg bass head and 2 big 15-inch bass bins. I don't remember how many watts it was, but I do remember thinking that it must be about 1000 watts, and we struggled to carry it. I had to bring my own guitar amp so that was an old 100-watt Marshall stack for me. We loaded in and set up and sound-checked. Then we had to do it all over again at the next venue. So yeah, it was a very different world back then. Now, Keith goes on to say, I remember in those days thinking how great it would be if someone could design a smaller, lighter, more portable combo amp that didn't weigh a ton, but it still sounded good. At the time, there was nothing available that I liked the sound of. I remember looking longingly at the Ampeg SVT, which was a hefty beast of an amp. But even though it was a combo, it was still bloody heavy, although not as heavy as dragging 2 big stacks and a huge bass drum around. Looking back, it seems strange that no one thought of designing something like that before. Most guitarists were happy to lug around a 100-watt head and 2 412 cabinets or something like that, but those bass players were always looking for more power. Nothing was ever loud enough. There was no such thing as a PA system back then. The bands provided the amplification and the stage volume. Well said, Keith. But those were different times. As we all know, venues these days want you to supply your own gear, so that makes things a lot easier. But back then it was a whole different ballgame. But what exactly is this thing? Well, this is an SVT of course, but the model name isn't actually stamped anywhere on the face of it. The only indication you have is the lettering in the grille cloth. This particular one is a later 60s model, although it looks very similar throughout its entire production run. Unlike most amps of the time, the entire unit is enclosed in a wooden cabinet with the top section housing the amp and the bass guitar input, volume control, treble, mid-range, and bass controls, and the presence boost, and below that is a big rotary switch for the overdrive channel. And then UVA got the power amp section, and the tube complement is KT88. Output valves with 4 ECC83 preamp valves. Then the bottom houses the speaker, which is a custom-made 15-inch driver. And the power rating of this is 100 watts RMS program music power output. Now that doesn't mean it'll hit 100 watts into any old load. That was just their way of rating amps back then. And that figure came about from a test signal into 215 OEMs. But the recommended load is for OEMs, and this is a cathode biased amp. So setting the bias is super simple. There's a big pot on the back that has a meter connected to it, and all you have to do is turn it up until the meter reads 20 milliamps, and that's all there is to it. But there is so much more to it than that, because the real beauty of this amp is in its overdrive channel. If you engage the overdrive, then you get a really warm and fuzzy overdrive tone that's very desirable. And it responds really well to playing dynamics. Play it nice and hard, and it will overdrive nicely. And then when you ease off, it backs off naturally. But who was behind the design of this, and how did it come about? Well, in the early 60s, Ampeg was owned by a company called Music, who also owned several other brands, and they realized that there was a gap in the market for a rock and roll music-oriented brand. They noticed that the competition was moving that way, and they wanted a piece of the action. So they tasked one of their employees, Dan Armstrong, with coming up with a suitable product, and he came up with the Dan Armstrong Orange amplifier. It was a big success, and Ampeg was born. At first, Ampeg products carried the Music logo, but that soon changed. Dan Armstrong, his vision for Ampeg was that it should be targeted at the rock music scene, and the name change was part of that strategy. He introduced a new series of amplifiers and instruments along with a new look and feel. New graphics, new advertising, new everything. Dan even hired a public relations firm to build awareness. This was unheard of in the bass world at the time, but it worked, and Ampeg grew. After selling the rights to the Dan Armstrong Orange brand back to Selmer, Dan moved on to create the legendary Music Man. But in the meantime, he left the reins of Ampeg in the hands of lead engineer Bill Hughes and his assistant, lead engineer Roger Cox. They were responsible for the creation of some of Ampeg's most famous designs, and both of them had one goal: to make the biggest, nastiest bass amplifier ever made. That bass amplifier was the SVT. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I heard this through the grapevine, I just had to get my hands on one. So I went out and bought one sight unseen, and I just assumed it would be this big, unwieldy thing. But when it arrived, I was surprised. Yeah, it's big, but it's not that unwieldy, and it sounds pretty special. It really does. If you have one of these in your life, let me know in the comments. It's always nice to hear from you guys. I hope you enjoyed the video today. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to support the channel, and I hope to see you in another video soon. Bye bye.